We start with a simple question. What is the kingdom of God like? But the answer is way complicated. It is like mustard, oh, but also like yeast. Or maybe treasure. Wait, perhaps it's like good fish and bad fish caught in a net, old things and new things, which is like way too much. So let's take a breath and begin at the beginning. It starts with seeds and yeast. When I was a kid, I went to Christian summer camp, which was called Mustard Seeds, which was supposed to be a simple concept, tiny, seemingly insignificant things with great potential for growth and goodness. Really. How about tiny and seemingly insignificant things with great potential for disruption and disorder? Well, that was almost certainly true of me and the other kids attending the summer camp, but it is also true of the mustard seed and the yeast to which we were compared. Both were considered dangerous and in need of very strict control. The mustard seed in the parable, of course, grows into a massive tree, providing a home for the birds of the air, which sounds great, but not if you're trying to grow food crops in a field, because you'll just end up with a field full of out of control weeds and a whole heap of birds who will eat everything you're trying to grow. Which is why in biblical times it was forbidden to plant mustard seeds. Yeast, or leaven as it is known, is of course famously hard to control because it is a naturally occurring process. If anyone watched the Netflix show Unorthodox, they would have seen a scene with a large Orthodox Jewish family gathered, and the kitchen is completely covered, every surface, every door, with tinfoil. And I had friends phoning me up going, what's tinfoil about? Well, the tinfoil is to prevent the accidental formation of leaven, which happens all the time when the moisture in the air mixes with motes of food and flour and the wild yeast spores that surround us and live on us, and begins to ferment. This is like a naturally occurring sourdough starter that's going on all over the place. And of course, used in a controlled setting, it can make bread rise, but uncontrolled, it rots and ferments and makes you sick. So it turns out that these seemingly very straightforward parables about growth are actually much more subversive. Which brings us to the next set: fishermen trawling for fish, both good fish and bad fish, and stewards bringing out chattels, both old and new. Well, the fish and the things are not what the kingdom of God is compared to. What it's compared to are the people. The people who are spectacularly bad, it would seem, at fishing and stewarding their properties, because they do not know how to separate the good from the bad, because they are enormously undiscerning. The parables are in really stark contrast to our reading about King Solomon that Erica's just read for us, because in this reading he's offered a gift, and he can have any gift he wants, and he chooses the gift of discernment, the wisdom to be able to separate out the good from the bad, which it seems as if the parables are directly undermining. Now, Solomon, we're told, desires this gift so he can govern and rule his populous nation. And it's certainly a very good job, a good gift for this job. Because if you can divide people into good people and bad people, if you can separate out the bad, then it's much easier to control and govern. Basically, people want to be good, so you tell them what's bad, and they unite against that bad and try and exclude it and tend to blame it for all the ills of their society. And this is what happened in Solomon's reign. We read in Chronicles that he was gifted at dividing his people. First of all, he divided them into foreigners and Israelites, and he enslaved the foreigners and set them to forced labor. When he ran out of foreign slaves, he divided his own people into rich people who paid their taxes and poor people who couldn't pay their taxes. And then he enslaved that lot as well, separating them out from the rest, and they were put to forced labor too. Like Solomon, we still are in the business of deciding and discerning what needs to be separated out to give us a good life. In Poland, currently, it's the LGBT community. In America, it's angry black men and undocumented migrants. In Afghanistan, it's educated, uppity women. And in the UK, I don't know, benefit scroungers and NHS tourists. It turns out in Solomon's time and in our time, the discernment of good and evil is a dangerous gift, which is why, of course, in the story of the very, very beginning, God tells Adam and Eve not to eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The start of all our troubles. Well, of course they did, and the rest is history. First came shame, then came dishonesty, outright lying, blaming others, shirking all responsibility, causing mayhem, all resulting from the desire to separate the good from the bad in themselves, in those around them, in the natural world. Jesus is the most unusual, maybe unique of human beings in his absolute refusal to divide people into good and bad. He makes no distinction between the pure and the impure, the good and the bad, the sane and the man, the sick and the healthy, the stranger and the neighbor. The one group of people he criticizes continually are the people who do the separating, never the separated. He opens his arms ever wider to include sex workers, mentally ill, bleeding women, lepers, criminals, collaborators, an ever increasing number of people whom their society labels bad. So the message of Adam and Eve, of King Solomon's dubious reign, of the parables we've just heard this morning, seems to be that human beings are supremely unsuited to discerning good from evil. The kingdom of God. What is the kingdom of God like? The kingdom of God is all about bringing things into union. It joins those things that were separate, the sacred and the profane, the human and the divine, the good and the bad. It is radically, radically inclusive. And if we are to build the kingdom of God on earth as it was in heaven, what we should definitely not do is start deciding who's good and who's bad and separating them out. What then should we do? Well, we should be like those extremely foolish farmers and fishermen in our parables, like the man who sowed mustard seed in his field, the woman who hid leaven in the flour, the net that brought in all the fish, good and bad, regardless, the steward who brings out all the things, old and new. The kingdom of God begins when we start to notice, when we make an effort to notice who is excluded and take action to include them. This looks like many different things depending on our context. It looks like a friend that Paula was telling me about, who on attending a sixth form open evening noticed that at the gate of the school there were a large crowd of black boys who could not visit the open day because the school stipulated that any child attending the open day needed to go with a parent. So she signed the whole bunch in as her own. It looks like the school children at St. Gabriel's College who, seeing the news several years ago, lobbied and campaigned relentlessly until Lambeth Council housed Syrian refugee families. It looks like the people we know working in churches to house the homeless, to provide activities and food for children in the holidays whose parents are working. At heart, it looks like seeing the world as if there were no division between good and bad, sacred and profane, human and divine. It looks like trusting a foolish and undiscerning God who sees no division either.